like to turn the lights up and make this a little more engaging by asking the faculty who have appeared in the videos and the featured presentations tonight to come up and to be available for questions from the audience. So that would be 6 of you. I can count. That would be Richard Matthews, Susan Turner, John Hipp, Wendy Goldberg, Roxanne Silver, and Sally Dickerson. Our featured showcase faculty for the evening. How about a round of applause for all of them?
Before I get started. So Sally, I'm just kind of curious, when you did those experiments with the speeches in front of no one and in front of a group, if you thought about repeated, so the more you talk in front of a group, would the stress level go down?
We haven't done that series of studies. But there have been some researchers who have done that, where they bring people into the lab and they have them repeat the stressor again and again. And what they typically find is that most people do habituate. So you see significant declines in cortisol responses over time. The most significant drop is from day 1 to day 2. But you still do see small but significant cortisol increases among a proportion of the individuals. And when you do analyses to try to identify what is it about those people where they're not habituating to the stressor, what you typically find is those are the individuals who have low self-esteem. And so self-esteem seems to be sort of a buffer that allows individuals to habituate over time, whereas those who maybe are not as confident in those kinds of situations, you see the repeated cortisol activation.
Maybe too early for this result, but I'm wondering if you're yet able to determine any parallels between the post-disaster situation in Chile, the Chilean earthquake, to something like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Are there any parallels that you could identify at this point?
Well, I didn't study Hurricane Katrina, but I did study the September 11th terrorist attacks. And one of the things that we saw after the terrorist attacks were that people did not need to be directly exposed to the attacks, but merely watching them on television had a very strong psychological response. And in fact, individuals who reacted to the attacks with a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and a lot of distress, in fact, had increased incidence of heart problems several years later. Now, in the research that I did in the United States since after September 11th, I was able to see that people did not need to be directly exposed. We've just collected some data on several thousand people in Chile, and one of the things that we're seeing is that the rates of post-traumatic stress outside the epicenter are very high. In fact, in Santiago, the rates of post-traumatic stress were much higher than one would expect. Those individuals were not in the epicenter. And when I was actually in Chile, and when I went to from the city that was outside the directly impacted area, and then I went into the area that was at the epicenter, people told me, you know, our impact was 500 times what people in Santiago were feeling. Yet, in terms of the psychological response, we didn't see much difference. If one experiences an 8.8 earthquake and your entire building sways for 3 minutes, even if you're not directly getting that 8.8 shock, it can still have strong psychological consequences. So in terms of Katrina or the Gulf Coast oil spill or any natural disaster that we see a lot of comparisons between them. And we do see across the world doing research outside of the United States a lot of similarities as well.
I have a question about the prison numbers, and it's kind of a two-parter, I guess. The first one is, you were talking about 1 in 100 people being incarcerated. So my question is twofold. One, can you compare and contrast that number with, say, Western Europe? And also talk about the cost of incarceration, which seems to be our form of punishment, vis-a-vis what others might be doing. And I'm not talking about soft costs now, but really hard costs in terms of counseling or support or whatever is being done successfully.
Well, the figures of 1 in 100, and I wish if my mother was sitting here, she'd just be wringing my neck for my noun-verb agreement. But 1 in 100 is incarcerated. That's from the Pew Foundation, that's sort of nationally, and it does vary by region. We have a very high incarceration rate in the United States. California, even though we have about 167, 170,000 incarcerated, the largest number in the United States, our rate is kind of in the middle. We're kind of regular in California in terms of where the percentage of the population that is incarcerated. But the United States vis-a-vis Western Europe, very, very high incarceration rates. Only some of the other third world, what people might call the developing countries have some, and some of the Arabian countries have very high rates. So we are really a distinction of having such a very high rate. Now, in terms of alternatives, and the costs are very high. In California, the budget for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which manages 100,000 people on parole and 170,000 people in the prisons, was generally about $10 billion, and we're now about at 8.8, about $9 billion, depending on the cuts. Of course, we don't have a budget, so we spend an enormous amount of money, and it's a fight between the UC system and the Cal States and the prisons in terms of who's going to get the dollars, and we're all very cognizant of that fact. So that the costs are very great, and in California, of course, most of the costs are capital costs, but it costs basically $50,000 of our taxpayer dollars per year per offender to incarcerate them in the state. That's a lot of money, and what people are often trying to do is to find alternatives to incarceration. The research on alternatives to incarceration is not as silver bullet as people would like. We would like to be able to have incarceration alternatives that are inexpensive and very effective. But generally, alternatives and things may change your recidivism rates by 15%, maybe up to 30%. So we don't have a lot of room for improvement, but it can have some cost implications. So it's a hard puzzle because, yes, we incarcerate a lot of people. We should be trying alternatives that are not incarceration. What it takes, though, is political will. And what happens in the state of California is there's a lot of work at the margins, work on parole, work on trying to prevent people coming back. We don't have a lot of the political strength to work on the front end of the system, passing sentencing laws or having a sentencing commission that'll sort of clean up our hundreds and hundreds of penal codes that are just, add together sentences and stop the influx into the prison system. I think that's what we really need to focus on.
Well, the second part of the question is, what does Europe do vis-a-vis what we do, and what does that cost?
I don't know. I don't have the cost for Europe, but they do have fairly high property crime rates in Europe. They don't have as high violent crime rates. So I can't give you a cost. I'm not someone who does a lot of studying of the international costs. But the reason why our costs are so high is incarceration. So some of the things that they said they have in Europe that they don't have here, which we try to have here, is something called day fines, for example, where you use a fining mechanism rather than an incarcerative mechanism to keep people under control of the system. So there are some more community-based alternatives in Europe that we have a lot to learn from, but we don't put into play a lot.